This webinar is being recorded, and the recording of the presentation will be posted on mass.gov/2030 CECP within a week. We ask that you remain on mute and keep your cameras off until the end of the presentation. If you have a clarifying question or have logistical questions, you can let us know in the Q&A box. I know the screen says chat, but if you can put those comments or questions in the Q&A box. All right, I will turn it over to Undersecretary now.
Great, thank you, Han. Good evening, everyone, and welcome, and thank you for taking the time this evening to join in this conversation. And we will be repeating this dialogue again tomorrow at noon. So we wanted to make sure that we have sufficient amount of time to share with you what the administration has been working on regarding the Clean Energy Climate Plan, what we're trying to accomplish over the next few months, and certainly open up an opportunity for additional input and hearing your comments. We have received, just to reiterate or to kind of go back a little bit in time, I wanted to remind the first few slides and my presentation is to just share with you what has happened in the past and kind of remind everybody where we are. We have received public feedback on the interim Clean Energy Climate Plan, which was delivered at the end of last year, 2020. And I will talk a little bit about those feedback. And then subsequent to that, we had a new climate legislation with new requirements, and EEA is going to take that new set of requirements and really work hard in achieving and meeting all of the requirements. And I'm going to talk about our plan and approach in doing so tonight. There will be additional opportunities for your input, and we left enough hearing what your comments were last time. We are leaving some time tonight to really not just hear you, but also have a dialogue around these topics. And as mentioned earlier, we will have plenty of opportunities for you to ask questions, and I will try my best to answer your questions. And to the extent that I don't know the answers, I will let you know and probably ask you to put your requests in writing so that we can get back to you with sufficient answers. Next slide, please. A quick reminder and refresher of where we were. December of last year, we put out two pretty large documents. The first one is the 2050 decarbonization roadmap that covers various different pathways of how to reach net zero by 2050. It involved a cross-sectoral look and looking at across the different pieces of the economy and what we would need to achieve under different assumptions to reach net zero by 2050. We also, at the time, set the emissions limit at 45% reduction relative to 1990 level for 2030. In setting that limit, we conducted an analysis and produced an interim Clean Energy Climate Plan for 2030 that was released simultaneously with the roadmap study. Subsequent to that, we had several public comment periods on the interim 2030 CECP that we put out back in the end of last year. We had a public webinar on the 2050 roadmap, and then we had several public webinars on the interim 2030 CECP. Just a reminder the 2050 decarbonization roadmap was really a look out into the future all the way to 2050 and trying to analyze the different sectors of the economy and what we need to do to reach 2050 and achieve net zero. Whereas the 2030 Clean Energy Climate Plan was focused on this decade and what the activities and the policies and describe the programs we need to implement in this first decade to achieve. At that time, we anticipated about a 45% reduction. Subsequently, of course, the climate legislation set a different limit, and I will talk about that. I want to clarify that these are two separate activities, even though they were produced at the same time. One is really focusing on the next 3 decades, whereas the CECP for 2030 was much more focused on the first decade and what the activities and the programs and the policies will need to be to achieve a significant reduction in the first decade. At that time, we also said in the interim CECP for 2030 that the action has to take place now, immediately, because we recognize through the roadmap study that while 2050 sounds far away, we actually only have certain opportunities to do this right and to do this in the least cost way. And to accomplish those things, we actually need to start planning today, but also to take actions today. So I'm going to share with you today on the continual planning of these efforts and some of the actions that we have already started to take. Next slide, please. Subsequent to the fact that we put out the 2050 decarbonization roadmap and the 2030 interim Clean Energy Climate Plan, we received public comments on the CECP. You can see on the slide here, we see many comments during the public comment period, and to elevate equity and environmental justice in our policy setting and the support provided for environmental justice communities. Related to that, another topic is to ensure that there is a just transition and development for our workforce and ensure that the training programs are available for workers, particularly in environmental justice communities, as well as those that may need to transition from their work from one sector to another, or within the sector, but transitioning to a clean energy economy. Third is funding and financing for programs to support all of the activities and policies and programs that we aspire to do and need to accomplish in the first decade over the next 30 years. There were many supporters of raising the 2030 emissions limit from 45% to 50% reduction from the 1990 level. Next slide, please. And subsequent to that, there was a proposed legislation in the first quarter of this year, which culminated into a final piece of law and the act of creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy that was signed by Governor Baker on March 26, 2021. In it contained many new rules and regulations, rules and directions about how we need to achieve the 2050 net zero emissions reduction. The statewide greenhouse gas emission limit needs to be planned out for every 5 years between last year and 2050. Included in the act also was sector-based statewide emissions sublimits. So we are required to set not only the limits, the emissions limits for the entire economy, which were set every 5 years in the law, but also sectoral specific emissions, which in this presentation and in all of our conversation going forward, I will call them sublimits. In the Act, it also required a roadmap plan to realize each emissions limit, which we really had already started by that 2050 roadmap study that I just referred to earlier. So we are planning to update that 2050 roadmap every so many years, and I will talk about that next. Next slide, please. The new statutory requirements are on the slide. First, on the left-hand side, you see the emission limits. The 2030 statewide or economy-wide emissions limits will be at least 50% below the 1990 level by 2030 or in 2030. The interim 2040 statewide emissions limits will be at least 75% below the 1990 level. And of course, as we had already set before, the statewide emission limit for 2050 will achieve at least net zero statewide or economy-wide. In the law also includes emissions sublimits, and this means that we are required to set limits by sectors of the economy. While the interim CECP had already set targets by different sectors of the economy, the law now requires us to be very specific about subsector or sector and the sublimits for each sector. And these are the categories that's included in the statutory requirements: electric power, transportation, commercial industrial heating and cooling, residential heating and cooling, industrial processes, natural gas distribution service, and any other sector that we may want to designate. Next slide, please. In addition, the statutory requirements also, as you see here, required EEA, our agency here, to provide a publication of a comprehensive and clear roadmap plan to realize the limits. And each roadmap plan have many requirements, including the things that I'm going to talk about in the Clean Energy Climate Plan, but also in addition to those that we already started to report, those that are associated with natural working land, or including statewide baseline measurements and tracking of current carbon flux on natural working lands, statewide goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestration on natural working land, and the natural working land plan that outlines actions to meet these statewide goals. On the right-hand side, you can see that the law also sets deadlines on when we must develop the plan and publish the plans. I won't read all of the dates, but you can see essentially in the initial years, it's really every year, and then every 5 years, we are required to set the emissions and limits and sublimits, so sectoral limits, and the plan every 5 years. In addition, we are to update any revisions to the 2050 plan and the limits for the 2050 net zero roadmap. Next slide, please. So going forward, well, actually, before I talk about going forward, so many months have really passed since the climate bill has been instituted. We have been working on developing and really updating the Clean Energy Climate Plan. We've been working on looking at the policies and the included in the interim CECP about how we want to achieve the 45, but then now 50% reduction in the next 8 years by 2030. Many stakeholders have mentioned that we should not just continue our activities in the planning, we should actually start the programs necessary to achieve the 50% reduction by 2030. So in the last, I guess it's almost 6 months or so, we have been working at strategizing and laying out the plans and setting up programs and developing them further on different tracks and soliciting feedback on many activities. So in some ways we are at the planning stage, but at the same time, we're also implementing many of the policies that we think are no regrets strategies. When we think back about the new Clean Energy Climate Plan or the updated Clean Energy Climate Plan, we will be completing that as required by the law to be published by July 1st, 2022, next year. In the CECP, we are proposing to really do two things. We are going to update the 2030 Clean Energy Climate Plan, and we will add the 2025 plan in the same document. We are continue to accept comments and questions on these topics, and feel free to continue to send us your comments. We essentially just decided to allow that sort of, if you have questions or input, to continue to send those to us via the email link that you see here, or website link you see on the slide here. We are committed to develop strategies, policies, programs that will help Massachusetts reach 50% emissions reduction by 2030. Everything we're doing right now is to make sure that we achieve that. We're also making sure that we try to be as specific as possible with very clear timeline for all of the policies and programs that we're setting in place. We also heard the feedback loud and clear on expansion of the discussion on equity and just transition and developing equitable policies and programs so that as we develop the programs for this transition, we don't leave people behind, and we are paying close attention to our environmental justice communities. You can see the website on the slide if you have any more questions, or if you want to follow the updates on our efforts in the 2025 and 2030 CECP. Next slide, please. This is another reminder slide of where we were in the interim CECP. We had set out draft policies to say that we need highly efficient new buildings. And I will talk a little bit more about building codes in the next few slides. On the existing buildings, we already reached very high in anticipating that we need to retrofit about 1 million homes and 350 million square feet of commercial buildings. And all of those will be involving reducing the use of fossil fuel in heating of buildings. On the transportation side, the no regrets strategy going forward is also electrification of our transportation. So we aim to have 750,000 new zero-emission cars and trucks on the road by 2030, with 20,000 new ZEV or zero-emission vehicles on the road for medium and heavy duty vehicles. We aim to reduce miles traveled in all commuter miles. And these are policies that we set as targets in the interim 2030 CECP, and we're working hard right now with our partners, both in the public sector and in private sector, to try to mobilize the efforts and the people and the resources to accomplish these targets. On the power sector, we aim to have 6,000 megawatts of new clean energy built and interconnected by 2030, including needing new transmission lines that will help deliver clean energy to Massachusetts. We also started last year and will continue and have actually aggressively upgraded our efforts in working with the ISO. It's an independent system operator of New England on the transmission planning and clean energy markets for New England. So these are just a few examples of the key topics that were included in the interim 2030 plan that was released last year. Next slide, please. On this slide, I want to share with you where we have been working and what our current thoughts are. There are a lot of numbers on this slide. I will just quickly cover by the columns what they actually mean. So in the rows, you see buildings, transportation, electricity, and non-energy industrial sectors. These are the sectors of the economy included in our clean energy climate plan. And they were actually also included in the roadmap study because we broke apart the economy into these subsectors and analyzed what and how much greenhouse gas emissions we need to get out of each of these sectors. On the columns, you see the 1990 column and the 2017 column. Those are numbers in million metric tons of CO2 equivalent. So these are actual numbers from 1990 and the 2017 numbers. These are actuals as measured by our tracking mechanism in the state. And at the time that we published the CECP, 2017 is the most up-to-date or the most current data we have from actual emissions. And what you see is the gross emissions, which is really the sum of the rows you see under 1990 is 94.5 million metric ton emissions economy-wide. 2017 level is 73 million metric ton. So essentially what this means is around 2017, the year 2017, we had achieved 23% of reduction relative to 1990. So these are the historical numbers. At the time, we look forward to 2030 and we looked at, what it means to reduce significantly the emissions from these sectors throughout 2030. And the range of the numbers are shown in the third column under 2030. And at the bottom of the rows, at the bottom of the column that says 2030 shows you the percent reduction from 1990. So it shows you that as we were projecting out how to reduce the emissions from each of these sectors, we anticipated that we need to achieve 45 to 48%. Well, it's more about setting the policies to maximize the reduction for 2030. And we estimated that we can accomplish 45 to 48%. This is at the time, at the end of last year. So now the question is, what do we need to do to really get us to the 50% mark reduction by 2030? The key topics on the right-hand side are what we're beginning to think about, and really there's sort of a quantitative side, the analysis associated with the emissions, as well as the policy side. And just to give you a perspective, we're essentially building up each policy, each type of program, and then estimating what the range of emissions reduction we might get, we would like to get, and we will push really hard to get from each of these policies. So we build these up because it's a projection of the future. We're building them up sector by sector, but also program and policy by policy. So the column on the right-hand side shows you some of the activities that we're taking on that we think and we will act to make sure we achieve the 50% reduction by 2030. And 50% of the 94.5 million metric ton is 47.3 million metric ton. That's what you see at the bottom of the right-hand column. And the activities include, for building sector, we are kicking off the Commission on Clean Heat and a regulatory process at the Department of Public Utilities to really help us develop the subsector or the building sector or the heating sector emissions reduction that we have to achieve by 2030. There are many other activities, so I'm just highlighting a few things here. We're hoping with the Commission for Clean Heat, we're gathering experts from the sector, the building sector, but also experts on those from the sectors that will, from the parties or the stakeholders that will actually be affected by reducing emissions from the building sector or the heating of the building sector. On transportation, we're exploring opportunities to limit light-duty vehicle fleet growth. So in addition to electrifying transportation, we're also exploring opportunities to reduce essentially driving, because we're not only reducing the emissions by changing over the drivetrain or the fuel use for vehicles, we also want to make sure we capture any opportunity we can to reduce driving. Third, on the electricity sector, the climate law did increase the RPS, which is a renewable portfolio standard that sets the requirement of how much renewable resources that we must adopt. The municipal light plants commitment to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There are several utilities or several municipalities around the state that have municipal light plants that are not the same as our investor-owned utilities. And so the climate law has increased their commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then from non-energy and industrial sector, we are hoping that the federal action on HFC will be complementary to our policies, and we are working with Mass DEP on our own policies around HFC. I also want to highlight on transportation, because we did hear a lot of feedback on transportation. We're working very closely with our partners at Department of Transportation to really capitalize on the really great work that they are already starting to do, and we're going to work with them more than we have in the past, and really try to partner up with our sister agencies so that we can help and mobilize the efforts from both agencies to maximize emissions reduction from transportation. Next slide, please. We wanted to give you an opportunity to see what the timeline of all of these activities are. So we decided to put on 2 slides just the various different key topics or main topics that we are addressing. The first set of columns here are the Clean Energy Climate Plan that we've been just talking about. We want you to know that we are not only updating the energy pathway analyses, we are also conducting a new macroeconomic and employment impact analysis. We're developing, of course, as we said, the updated 2025-2030 plan. We are going to set the limits and sublimits for 2025 and 2030. And then you can see there are some other timelines to just, make sure that we're consistent and we're communicating with the public. The yellow dots on all of these Gantt chart colors are estimated times for public sessions, just like this one, where we can report out and hear your feedback on our efforts. The second set of colors, the green ones, are our efforts on natural working lands. We have already started to conduct forest carbon analysis, as well as natural working land inventory improvements. We are also developing our natural working land plans as part of the CECP, and then planning to set the baseline and the goals of what we can achieve from our natural working lands. The third column, the rows, are the Commission on Clean Heat. The governor just signed the executive order to establish the commission a few weeks ago, and we are planning to convene the commission in the next few weeks. And through this commission, we're going to work with all of the experts represented to develop a recommendation. And some have asked whether the timing of the commission really works. And I have to admit that because we need the Clean Energy Climate Plan to be complete by July 1st of 2022, we will work with the commission as quickly as we can to make sure that as much of the recommendation as possible can be collected through about the first and second quarter of next year, so that we can incorporate as many of the recommendations as possible. In other words, I'm hoping that the commission, once convened, the heavy lifting and the hard work will actually be in the first 6 months or so of the commission. And then there will be other efforts about developing policy recommendation, and there will be continual work through the end of next year. Next slide, please. This next slide covers 4 other lines of work. The first sets of rows are on environmental justice. We are developing EJ strategies. We have updated MEPA environmental impact. We are developing the environmental impact regs with MEPA and developing cumulative impact assessment regulation. And again, you see the dots where public sessions are anticipated. In the power sector, we had just received offer bids in the 3rd round of the offshore wind RFP, where we're targeting to procure 1,600 megawatts more offshore wind. And the contracts are expected to be submitted to the Department of Public Utilities by the end of the year or the beginning of the year. And there will be an approval process at the Department of Public Utilities. We have begun a process to develop the scope of a technical potential for solar. We have quite aggressive policies and programs to encourage solar development in the state. However, there's a lot of coordination work that needs to be done, particularly how we integrate solar resources onto our distribution and transmission grid. So one of the efforts to do there is to make sure that we understand where the solar resources are likely to be developed so that we can plan the distribution and transmission grid better. And another really continual effort is to work with our independent system operator on the wholesale market, which is a market for electricity transactions, and how those resources will transact in that market, which the wholesale electricity market is regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and we're also working with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to put in our voice about how we believe that the wholesale market needs to be reformed to support all of the clean energy we need for the state. On the transportation sector, currently developing TCIP model rules, and we'll continue to work with our Department of Transportation and our utility partners to expand EV incentives and incentives for charging infrastructure development. And we're also working with our sister agency to develop recommendations on shifting mode and land use issues. On the building sector, I already talked a bit about some of the activities, but very importantly, we also are setting our goals for the first 3 year in this decade of the energy efficiency plan. That's the first row under building sector. We have already developed the greenhouse gas emissions goals and targets for which that the energy efficiency plan needs to meet. And then we need to develop those plans with the program administrators. The third row shows that we are developing, as part of the requirement of the climate bill, the specialized stretch energy code regulation, and our Department of Energy Resources are developing those building codes with our partners at Housing and Economic Development. We're also developing appliance efficiency standard regulation, as well as our utilities and our regulators are working on proposals of what the future of our gas business, natural gas business would look like, and what regulatory and financial arrangements might be needed to smooth those transitions. Next slide, please. This is a screenshot of the website. Please visit the 2030 CECP website for more information on ways to provide input, as well as on other key initiatives that support the development of the 2025 and 2030 CECP. I actually just realized I'm spending way more time than I anticipated to go through these slides, so I will try to cover the rest of it a bit more quickly so that we have enough time for people to chime in. Next slide, please. The targets for March of 2022 is that we would like to come back and present and gather input on proposed emission limits and sublimits, and propose goals for reducing emissions from our natural and working land and increasing carbon sequestration capabilities from our natural working land. And at that time, we would also like to come back and share with you some proposed policy, or I would call them portfolio of policies, to achieve the emissions targets that we set for ourselves. Next slide, please. In the next two slides, I will dive in a little bit deep on the sort of emissions tracking mechanism. This slide is intended to show you the difference between what we call gross emissions reduction and net emissions reduction. And this is a necessary step because we are set to be net zero economy-wide by 2050. So one of the questions that came up internally here is, how do we set the emissions target for 2025 and 2030 on our way and on our path to deliver a net zero economy by 2050? And this is in some ways, a hypothetical or illustrative example of how we're thinking about gross emissions and net emissions. So for every subsector that I just talked about earlier, we have transportation, buildings, electricity, and non-energy. Each sector would have a certain emissions level and adding up to a total emissions level. And then the sort of light green and the dark green shows you the biogenic emissions from our natural land and forestry in our forests, and the carbon sequestration capability from our land. So the net emissions is the gross emissions, which is the added up emissions from all the sectors, plus the emissions from biogenics and reduction by sequestering carbon with a net emissions. So our net emissions in 2050 needs to be 0. We are currently proposing to set our 2025 and 2030 emission limits at the gross level, which is that dark brown or the 73 number on the screen, while we keep track of the net emissions on an annual basis, starting back in history and going forward. So essentially, this picture that you're seeing is how we would track our net emissions, but we are setting our targets based on gross emissions. And we have looked at these numbers. I don't want to get too deep in the numbers, but we have looked at these numbers. The ultimate target doesn't actually differ very much, meaning it's not going to lighten or strengthen our policies or our goals by very much, whether we set our targets by gross or net. But it is important from an accounting perspective how we're setting these goals. Next slide, please. I more or less have covered already the detailed explanation of this gross versus net emissions, but we thought we kind of put the slide out there for people who want to just read it in words instead of reading the graph. So I'm going to just leave you this. I think it will be on the website after and we can also come back to this if there are questions on this. Next slide, please. We are looking for your feedback on this as well. The law says in the gray box, the sub limits that we should be setting. And the language is as such, electric power, transportation, commercial, you can read that in the gray box. We are proposing to do one thing that's not exactly the way it's described in the law, but we believe it will accomplish what the law wants us to do. And this is because we have an inventory for greenhouse gas emissions in the electric sector. That means we measure the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, by the supply of electricity, not necessarily at the consumption level, but at the supply level, because we can measure from the power plants how much emissions are emitted with the production of electricity. This means that when we get to the buildings, which now on the left-hand side of the slide, you can see we are going to account for the emissions from the residential, commercial, industrial, more on the fuel that's being used on site. So for example, I heat my home with natural gas. The emissions associated with the use of natural gas will be counted with the residential in my home and all the other homes that use natural gas. The emissions associated with the use of fuel on site. We will at the same time keep track of, on an estimated basis, the consumption of the electricity at the residential, commercial, industrial level. But when we set the sub limits, we would set it to avoid redundancy. We would set it at the residential, commercial level, but on the on-site fuel use, so that we keep track of how much electricity is being used and therefore how much emissions are from electric sector. But the limits and the sub limits of residential and commercial industrial are actually set at the on-site, associated with on-site fuel use. And I can come back and answer any questions on this if this is confusing. But we want to put this out there that we are going to set we propose to set the emissions limit based on-site use for the fuels, and then the electricity sector for the electric power production. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I've come to a point where, sort of this one-way delivery of information is complete for this evening. And I would like to just use these questions as a prompt for a dialogue. We want to hear your thoughts about the gross emissions setting the limits on the gross emissions while tracking and lowering the net emissions through policy development. We want to hear your feedback about the sublimits, the one I just talked about, that's consistent with the way we account for emissions in the state already and the way that we have accounted it historically, but still match and track them according to the law. And then thirdly is just essentially the approach that I described today, if there's any concerns that you would like to raise. So I'm going to open that up now for any questions or dialogue. Let me just see, I want to know, make sure if you have any questions, you can submit the questions certainly on the website anytime really between now and end of the year. If you want to ask questions now, please press that raise hand button that you see at the bottom of your screen. And we will then unmute you and you can speak. We would like to limit your questions and input and conversation to 2 minutes, just because in case there are many people asking questions or just wanting to have a dialogue, we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to do so. And for those in the live interpretation, using the live interpretation in other languages, you can ask the question and provide input in any of the 5 languages, and our interpreters will interpret them into English so that I can understand them, and I will try to answer them. And for those joining on the phone, you can press *9 to indicate you would like to speak. And when we call on you, you have to press *6 to unmute yourself. And again, I would like to have everybody be respectful in your answer and your dialogue, as well as making sure that we can limit your time to about 2 minutes so that we can give everybody a round of opportunity. If I did not forget anything, Han, I'd like to open it up at this point.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, before we go to the queue, just to give people time to raise their hand, including the people on the phone, we do have some questions that have been submitted. So why don't I ask those questions first? And then we'll go to the queue. So we have some questions about hydrogen fuel cell. How and when will Massachusetts include hydrogen fuel cell infrastructure to support the transportation sector, particularly as it solves utilization and payload concerns of medium duty and heavy duty fleet operators?
Yeah, that's a very good question. We are definitely currently considering all zero emission transportation. But you're right, I think our current sort of short-term policy is mostly focused on electrification of transportation as opposed to hydrogen infrastructure. So I will take that input as an interest and take that back into our sort of planning efforts. Thank you for your comment.
And then we have another question along the lines of hydrogen, but for the building sector. Will Massachusetts look at and give consideration to hydrogen, and in particular renewable hydrogen, to decarbonize natural gas?
That is a very good question as well. I'm sure our natural gas utilities are considering those options. From what I have read, and I have read quite a bit on this, because I too am very curious and try to understand the economics of hydrogen in heating. So this is not hydrogen for industrial use. This is hydrogen for heating. There's a rich dialogue around this topic. And I'll just say this, we are open to technological improvements, including potential future use of hydrogen, but currently the use of hydrogen for heating is not economic. And so, could that become economic in the future, say 2035, 2040, possibly, and we're certainly open to that. So we don't want to exclude and we don't want to go down a path where we limit ourselves in great technological breakthrough in the future, but we also need to act now in this decade. So as the roadmap study had shown, our current sort of no regrets strategy for decarbonizing heating is to transition to heat pump when it comes to heating. But of course, the first step we need to do before that is to increase efficiency. That means for new buildings, we need to tighten the envelope of buildings as much as we possibly can, especially at the opportunity of a new building. And for retrofitting existing buildings, that's also still our number one effort, is to increase the efficiency of our existing buildings. So the lowest cost approach to this is we want to tighten the envelope and then use as little as possible fuels or electricity or any source of heating. And being in the climate we're in, I think that is still the least cost and the most comfortable solution for our residents.
Great. We have another question for the building sector. What is our position on natural gas fired combined heat and power?
Han, maybe we can, until somebody asks a question on the slide, maybe we can stop sharing the slide.
Oh, that's right. Apologies.
It was a combined heat and power, our views on combined heat and power.
Fired by natural gas.
Yes, we, on all pathways, we have to reduce emissions. And so we are transitioning our resources to clean resources. And so our policy direction is to reduce any incentives for emitting resources. And if it is an emitting resources, we should transition to not provide additional incentives for emitting resources.
I see that there are quite a few hands, so I'm going to go to the first person in the queue, and then we'll go back to a submitted question. So we'll go back and forth like that, if that's okay. All right, Helen Walter Tierinoni, I'm going to allow you to speak.
Oh, thank you very much. Appreciate that. My name's Helen Walter Tierinoni. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at the Air Conditioning, Heating and Refrigeration Institute. And I have a couple questions and comments for your consideration. First of all, thank you very much for this detailed webinar and explanation of the plans. They're very clear and it's very helpful to better understand Massachusetts' way forward. I guess I don't have anything prepared, but as I kind of listened to the presentation, I just kind of thought through a couple of different things. You may know that AHRI, the Air Conditioning, Heating, Refrigeration Institute, was very, very supportive of the American Innovation Manufacturing Act. So that's the phase down of HFCs. And in fact, we've filed a petition with EPA asking them to regulate a date certain for the transition for air conditioning well before it's necessary under the phase down. So that should save an extra 500 million tons of CO2. So we're truly trying to lean in around greenhouse gas emissions. And I guess one of the things that we're concerned about is the—
Helen, sorry to interrupt, but you might need to slow down a little bit for the translators.
I'm so sorry, interpreters. So one of the things that I'm concerned about is kind of what the UN would call enabling activities. So things that are necessary to make the transition occur. So for example, for the transition to low global warming potential, or GWP, refrigerants, building code changes are needed to allow those refrigerants in Massachusetts. So that would be an example of one thing that's needed. Maybe some other things to think through would be, certainly, of course, the capacity of the electric grid, as well as its, stability. I live out in the country, so stability of the grid is important, as well as certainly access for, of course, underserved communities and so on and so forth. But I think there are some basic enabling activities that maybe should be thought through, and I'm wondering if you would consider creating a work stream to look at some of those important issues.
I definitely, if there are important areas where we have not yet considered, I think it would definitely be worthwhile to look at it more carefully. So may I ask you to perhaps send us an email or something in writing so that we can take a closer look at your proposed approach or comments?
Absolutely. Be happy to share those, concerns. They're kind of barriers to entry. And I guess the other thing, as a way to look at this another way, another thing that could be considered would be transition in the state buildings, public buildings first, to kind of learn where the pitfalls may be or the challenges may be, as a way to kind of move things forward as well. So I'll certainly send you some comments around this issue.
Yes, and we completely concur, by the way, with state buildings. We already have a leading by example set of programs for state facilities. So I encourage you to also take a close look at that as well. And we can also have a separate dialogue on that if you'd like.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. To go to the question that was submitted in advance, how are we getting this information out to local communities, and how can they plan to comply with the roadmap requirements? I think this person is asking, how do we get the information that we have presented to local communities so they can comply with the requirements and the new efforts that we are proposing to do?
Well, we are conducting these public meetings, and we're also required by law, which we will do. We'll also have public hearings or meetings as we move forward. It's posted on websites. If there are additional efforts that's necessary, we definitely want people to know more about this. In fact, one of the barriers, I would argue it's a significant barrier, is actually getting relevant information out to everyone. I'll take electric vehicle as an example. The more people understand the range of available electric vehicles, not just today, but in the future, the more people understand what the plans might be for charging infrastructure, the more people are more willing to buy the next electric, buy the next car to be electric. So I do think, and then there are businesses that own fleets of vans and delivery vehicles, and the more we can share information as we get them, and the more we can get the experts to share with fleet owners of how to think about their businesses under a different type of vehicle, the faster and the more we can mobilize, and the more we can move up the sort of learning curve and the adoption curve for electric transportation. And same thing with I'll just say energy efficiency. The more people understand, and I learned a lot over just in the last few years, the more we understand the effects of our choices, the better off everybody is. The more we understand how we can contribute in conserving energy and to to keep our buildings more efficient and to purchase the next product, the better off everybody is, the faster we can scale up in the emissions reduction pathway. So that it's a very good question, but I do think education and public sessions are very important. And I would encourage really any non-government organizations or community organization that want to have a role in, sharing information with your communities to really step up and help us do that. Because the more people can understand, the easier this is for everyone.
And we have a few questions around solar, and I'll bundle them together to have you answer them, Judy. So we get some questions where people are wondering what's the impact, the land use impact of the roadmap's projection of needing a lot of solar from now until 2050, but then other are asking about what is the role of solar in getting us clean energy, especially to meet the more aggressive 2030 emissions limits. So could you address these questions, like what are the trade-offs between the solar, the need for solar, and their land use impacts?
Yes, I do think solar plays a significant role in our roadmap. Solar is a mature technology now, and the cost has come down significantly in the last decade. So solar is part of the portfolio of solutions. Solar comes with challenges, just like every sort of pathway we take. It's a new way of thinking. I already talked about integrating solar onto our grid. So there is a significant set of efforts at our Department of Public Utilities to help and to really to direct and to facilitate the planning of our grid to ensure that we have a distribution system, electric distribution system that can accommodate the amount of solar that will be needed, and really other distributed energy resources. So some solar resources in the future may need to be paired with storage to avoid large upgrade costs onto our distribution system. That's one side. That's one side of the equation. The other side of the equation is land use trade-off with land use. I'll just say in other states, when solar is developed, we have essentially policy on solar, and then there's a separate policy on permitting. So we have policy to encourage solar, and then there's policy to protect environment. And these don't necessarily they're obviously dependent on each other, but the policies are not necessarily simultaneously set. And I think Massachusetts has a strength in this where we actually do consider land use in setting solar programs. I do think, reasonable people may think differently about the trade-offs, just like everything else, we must have trade-offs. But I do think it's really important to protect our land because, as you saw earlier, we also need our land to do other things, including shading, planting trees for shading. We need our land for sequestering carbon in the future. And so these trade-offs are not easy and they're not straightforward. So I think we try to set as good a policy as possible and always keeping an eye on the balance between needing solar as part of our portfolio of resources for our clean energy, as well as we need to protect our land and our green space and and plant more and create more green spaces for the future for not only enjoyment, but also for carbon sequestration.
Right, and DOER, Department of Energy Resources, they're gonna embark on a solar technical potential study.
Yes, the solar potential study will be one of a major step to really have a better understanding of where the solar potential is. So it's a little bit of a misnomer to call it solar potential study. It's not just solar potential, it's more of a solar planning, sort of like how do we plan our system better if we can anticipate and really mark out where solar would be best deployed. I think would be better and it would remove some risks for developers and it will help sort of articulate the balance between land use and solar.
Okay, great. We're gonna go back to the queue. Brian Campbell, you're next.
Brian Campbell, thank you for letting me speak at this Zoom meeting. I was just hoping that you people would consider nuclear power as an option, new nuclear power. When we shut down Pilgrim Nuclear, that erased 62% of our green power generated in this state. That's including all the solar, the wind, and the hydro. 62% unplugged. And we could have kept that plant going. It was NRC licensed until 2032. But and all it needed was a subsidy to bring it up from 4 cents a kilowatt hour, which is what it was getting paid, to about 6 to 7 cents an hour kilowatt hour. That's the same price that we're going to pay to Hydro Quebec for the CMP, the Central Maine Power Line, which is now stalled in Maine. So I'm hoping that Massachusetts will back new nuclear. We need it. The father of climate change awareness, James Hansen, wrote today. The second essential action is wholehearted support and development and deployment of modern nuclear power. Otherwise, gas will be required to complement intermittent renewable energy for electricity generation. Not only did we shut down Pilgrim, but we also brought on a new gas plant down at the canal in 2019, 300 megawatts there. That's about half of Pilgrim.
Brian, just want to give you a warning. You have up 30 seconds, just so we have.
Okay, I'm going to finish up. So what we've done is in ISO New England is kill 2 nuclear plants Vermont Yankee and Pilgrim, 1,300 megawatts of generation, and replaced it with gas. That's the equivalent. If you see that nice big gas tank off of 93 as you're driving down in with the artwork on it, of about, I believe, around 40 of them a year. That's how much extra gas we're burning to make electricity in this state. It's nuts. So thank you for listening, and nuclear power, we need it. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
All right, we're gonna go next to Glenn Ayers. I apologize. Ayers? Glenn, can you?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, thank you very much. Thank you for this presentation and for taking my,
You just muted yourself.
I'm back. Am I back?
Yes.
Thank you. My question is, it has to do with policies across the various agencies that are under the executive office, and more specifically about the biomass policy in Massachusetts and also forest protection policy. And on the one hand, we have the Department of Energy Resources, which is promoting biomass, rolling back the RPS and APS regulations to encourage, incentivize more burning of trees in Massachusetts. Another agency, the Department of Conservation and Recreation, is cutting down our public lands, and approximately half of the wood that is cut down on our public lands is also going to biomass burning. And then we have another agency, the Department of Fish and Game, the Division of Fish and Wildlife, that is doing extensive cutting on publicly owned lands in Massachusetts, our wildlife management areas, where a lot of that wood, thousands of acres, is also going to support the biomass industry. And it's a policy matter that the administration seems to be saying that we need forests and we need to protect forests and we need them for their carbon storage and carbon sequestration. And yet at the same time, we have these other programs that are targeting the degradation of forests and especially public lands. And so I'm asking, how is this inconsistency being addressed through the Clean Energy Climate Plan and the analysis that you're doing of the land sector? And is there really a role for biomass in a clean energy plan? Because biomass is by far the dirtiest energy source that is acknowledged by all the science, that it's a highly polluting form of energy, and yet it makes up a significant portion of the so-called renewable energy portfolio in the state. And with the proposed changes to the renewable portfolio standard, it will be offshoring a significant amount of our clean energy fund money into other states like New Hampshire and Maine, which seems so inconsistent with everything you're talking about tonight. Thank you for the opportunity to ask that question. I'm sure it's a difficult one for you policy-wise, but we would really appreciate to hear it from the executive office. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. And you're right, it is a difficult balancing act. And I'm sure I won't be able to adequately address your full question. But I'll just say at the outset that I appreciate your concern about biomass, and we are too. I also appreciate your concern about land use and forestry, and we are too. We are also kicking off several initiatives to try to strike the balance, I guess, is the best way we can do this. Is there are, as you probably anticipate, there are different, very strong, different viewpoints on this topic, and we are try to be as transparent as possible and try to allow those voices to be heard. And we are also trying to, at the policy setting level, trying to find the right balance for land use, forestry, and the use of biomass. Han, did you want to add, just to maybe share a little bit about the various different initiatives we have on the land and forest side?
Sure, yes. One initiative that we're doing is developing an improved natural working lands carbon flux inventory. So for those who have been following Mass DEP's greenhouse gas inventory, it has a tab that tracks carbon sequestration from forests and the emissions from the loss of forest. We are improving that tracking because there's one little error in it, which has big implications. But then also to look at other land use and land cover types. So this effort is ongoing, starting in June when we hired a staff person to do this. And we will be engaging technical experts both in and outside of academia to really help us on the methodology, but then also on the data sources. So that's on the technical initiative. On policies and goal setting, to comply with the law, with the new law, is that we are going to convene public meetings, a series of public meetings in the next few months to get people's thoughts on where should we set goals to sequester additional carbon in our forests and in our other land cover types, and where should we set goals to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from degraded wetlands. So that policy track, we are developing a public process for that. And on the website, mass.gov/2030 CECP, we now have a directory of public processes that are happening or will happen very soon that informs the Clean Energy and Climate Plan for 2025 and 2030. And towards the bottom of that directory is a sign-up sheet for anyone who is interested in forest carbon goals and policies to sign up. And we will be reaching out to that list and other stakeholders who submitted comments on the land sector on the interim plan. And so we'll be publicizing future public meetings to those folks.
Thank you, Han.
We're gonna go next to Pope, Mr. Pope, Doug Pope.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. The decarbonization of our economy is going to cost billions of dollars. You folks, DPU, DOE, are charged with making decisions with the speed and depth of the investment with the electric distribution companies. Has EEA considered our suggestions that financing 30 to 60-year assets be financed using tax-exempt debt through mass development?
I'm sorry, the question is whether we had considered using debt
yes,
to finance.
No, typically the EDCs would finance it using their traditional sources of funding, which will be somewhere between 3.5 and greater interest rates, whereas tax exempt funds would be somewhere less than 3%, 2.5, 2.7%. Since you're financing billions of dollars and the savings would be hundreds of millions of dollars, to the ratepayer, have you considered using having the EDCs finance their infrastructure improvements through the use of tax exempt debt issued by Mass Development?
I think the short answer is no. I think your question, let me just make sure I understood it. You're suggesting that we can ask the EDCs to finance with sort of non-taxable financing mechanism, or do you mean don't ask the EDCs to finance through ratepayer dollars, but actually use public funding and raise money through debt to finance?
No, not through debt that would be on the balance sheet of the Commonwealth. This would be for tax exempt debt that people like institutional investors would invest in tax exempt bonds that are issued by Mass Development. Mass Development is a conduit for tax exempt debt, but it would require the involvement of, this is more like structured finance. It's going to require people with the expertise to be able to push through a lot of the impediments that are going to be in the face of trying to get something like this done. But this would be an enormous savings for the ratepayer if you could find a means and method of doing it. I've reached out to Mass Development. They've been very helpful, but they won't move any further without greater engagement with the executive branch or with the EDCs themselves. I've reached out to National Grid and spoken with some of their people, and they are working on it. I've reached out to Eversource. They're talking about examining this internally, and we haven't heard back from them. I've written to Mike Keneally, who's the Housing Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, and he's also the chair of Mass Development. And we're trying to there are a lot of, there's a lot of structuring that would need to be done to do something like this, but it would save the ratepayer a tremendous amount of money. And the traditional method of financing infrastructure improvements is through the shortest useful life method employed by the utilities. And some of the DPU proceedings, they've taken $100 million investment and have written that off over billable to the ratepayer in their proposal, 7 to 8 years, which is effectively like trying to finance your house in a 30 to 50 year asset in 7 years. So if you took these assets that would be, substations, poles, transformers, these are 30 to 60 year assets. If you were to put those on their own separate tariff, so now you're amortizing them over 30 to 60 years, and you're going to finance that with tax exempt debt. That's going to be the least cost method of doing these huge and timely infrastructure improvements that are otherwise, if they do it the traditional method, it's going to cost a lot of money.
Yeah, no, thank you for your question and concern. We are also very concerned about raising and using ratepayer money for all the transition we need to do. On the concern side, I completely agree with you, and we're doing everything we can to make sure that the transition can be at minimum cost. Particularly for ratepayers, because particularly if we want to transition and electrify much of our economy, we need the electric sector. We need to have affordable electricity prices. So on that side, completely agree. And but there is one other thing, which is you're absolutely right. Obviously, the cheaper the money is, the better everybody is. But I don't think it's not as straightforward as you have just described it. our investor-owned utilities are investor-owned utilities. They are commercial entities, and they borrow from the market. I don't want to get into too technical details on the financing side. We do have municipal plant utilities that are tax exempt, and they can get lower cost borrowing. And that is an interest. I mean, you can probably read up about this, but there are opportunities for municipal utilities, co-ops. In some other states, there are co-ops that can borrow at a lower rate. So that is true. I mean, the lower the cost of money is, the better off everybody is. But it is not, we could definitely look into this, but I doubt that we can use public agency to borrow money to transition it through the utility. And
this
that's
is
not a structure that I'm familiar with in the energy sector.
This is National Grid's already done this with a undersea sea cable that went from Nantucket to the mainland, and they did it through a particular vehicle. It was through, I'll call it a local something authority, and so there.
I apologize. Just want to make sure that we allow other folks to chime in. So if you can wrap up in 10 seconds, that will be great.
I will follow up with something in writing.
Thank you.
Just one note on that. I'm very familiar with that line. That line is contracted with LIPA, which is Long Island Power Authority, which is a public power that is tax exempt. Okay, perhaps next question or next comment.
Yes. Yeah, just to recognize we're at 7:33, so I just want to make sure everyone get a chance, those who have their hands raised get a chance to speak. But before we do that, we have a couple questions regarding workforce training and helping small businesses to help with the transition. For example, train small businesses to install heat pumps. So what is our plan? What is the Commonwealth doing to help with the transition by focusing on training small businesses and workforce?
That's a really great question. And just this afternoon, I was speaking with the CEO of our Mass Clean Energy Center about its strategies and plans to help with training workforce. So I think of education and training broadly, but really there are many, many pieces of education and training. And one of the things, as you mentioned in the question, is training. There's a sort of public education, sort of giving the public enough information or as much information as possible to help with the adoption, which I spoke about earlier. There's also education and training for the workforce. Now, Mass CEC, as part of the Clean Energy Center, as part of our economic development agency, a quasi-agency, they are taking on this effort to use actually some of the money provided by the legislation to develop training programs to help the transition. And as you mentioned, just installers, heat pump, there's a technological education, there is sort of public awareness, and then there's a training of the workforce. We understand that this is a barrier for transition, or I would say an opportunity to really transition the workforce. So we are working with Mass CEC, and Mass CEC is working with our Department of Labor, Department of Education, and our Executive Office of Housing Economic Development to to really develop good programs to help with the training of workforce.
Great. Okay, we're gonna go next to Alan Fierce. Alan, I muted you.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Judy. Want to thank you for this presentation. It's been very useful. I want to quickly go through your discussion questions. I have no problems with 1 and 2. But number 3, do you have any concerns regarding moving forward with the approach described? Yeah, I do. My concerns are timing and money. I'm looking at the timeline you've got there. And I see that in March, you're going to come back to us for further public input on what looks like a pretty close to final CECP for 25 and 2030. That looks to me like you're on track for having this finalized actually at the deadline, July 1, 2022. The statute actually says that it is to be completed, adopted, and published not later than July 1, 2022. I am wondering whether you have thought about getting this out sooner. Some of us who have been advocating, we advocated for the roadmap plan 2 legislative sessions ago, are just incredibly dismayed about how slow all of this is rolling out. And it seems to me you could actually publish earlier a couple of the chapters of the CECP, ones that you have much more work completed on, such as buildings, transportation. I know you're still working on the natural and working lands piece, and that could perhaps be a later filed chapter, but I'm wondering if you couldn't get done quicker if you got the other chapters out early. And here's another timing question. Money. The legislative budget calendar year begins this January with the governor filing his proposed budget. I am hoping in that proposed budget, you are going to have money to implement many of the programs that are going to cost quite a bit of money. We need to increase the incentives for purchasing electric vehicles. We need financial incentives and low-cost financing to do the insulation and heat pump work on buildings. The legislature will finalize that budget on perhaps June 30th next year, the day before you're going to be releasing this plan. And then will we have to wait another entire year, another budget year, before your plans can get funded and begin to get implemented? We're just losing so much time here. It's totally dismaying.
Well, first of all, thank you for your comment. I hear the urgency, and I'll tell you one thing, it's urgent in all of the administration staff that's working on this. So if you feel like it's not moving fast enough, we are moving as fast as we can. Certainly time and resources are our constraint. It's probably everybody's constraint in the work we do, but we are moving as quickly as we can. If you feel like we're not giving enough time for feedback, however, I want to encourage you to take a close look at the table that was contained in this presentation. We did reiterate what's in the interim CECP and the potential areas where we need to enhance to reach 50% by 2030 while developing the plan for 2025. So we are offering you this opportunity to chime in now so that we don't wait till the last minutes as we move forward. We must move forward, as you said, and we must move forward as quickly as we can. At the same time, I'm offering, and we want to offer you as many opportunities to chime in as possible, which is, please do take a close look at the interim CECP, look at the slide that's on this deck, and to note where we are enhancing those plans. So I think we're moving as quickly as we possibly can.
I appreciate that, Judy. I actually was a person who advocated with my legislators that you get more staff. And in the previous budget and this most recent budget, I understand there were 8 positions that were created. Do you have enough staff? Should we be advocating for more help for your office? I know that's a hard question for you to ask as a member of the administration, but I'm happy to make that pitch to my legislators.
We are grateful for the budget that's just been approved for this fiscal year. So we are, with a tight labor market, I must say, I'm not even sure that the constraint is on the budget or the of the staff. It's really to actually hire good people to help. We do have great people right now, and everyone's working really hard. I do feel like we have a really solid team right now. And again, we're doing the best we possibly can to meet all of the requirements under the climate law.
Okay, we're gonna go next to Cindy Aarons.
Thank you very, very much. I appreciate the opportunity to give some feedback tonight. A couple of points talking about using hydrogen or quote unquote renewable natural gas. I appreciate your comments about them being high cost and not really realistic. I would also caution to be very clear and sure that that there's not some greenwashing with this renewable natural gas, that it does take a lot of emissions to create the hydrogen that's needed for those kinds of operations. So that's just one point. On education and outreach, I think those are really, really important things. I agree, and I would just say that perhaps you could lean on the individual municipalities, the local governments, to try and get some of those words out, as some of that education out as well. And in some municipalities, maybe there's some education that needs to happen within them. You also have a lot of, I'm a member of one of them, you have a lot of grassroots organizations that are working feverishly to try and meet our goals. And that's because we're, not just because we want to, follow whatever state legislation is passed, but we know that we have a time crunch. We are running out of time to make a significant impact in our climate, in our carbon emissions. And so on that note, and I appreciate some previous commenters' comments about the timing that we need to, and I appreciate that you're all working very hard, but I feel that it needs to be reiterated. I'm concerned about my children and people's children and grandchildren, and what sort of environment we're going to be leaving them with. So I'll sort of end with the concern that I have. I can appreciate this clean heat commission that the governor wants to put together. But I sort of feel like there's a lot of work that's been done already. We sort of know how we can transition these buildings to our buildings to clean heat back in May of 2020. So that's 18 months ago now. The New England Energy Efficiency Partnership, along with 50 or plus other professionals that vetted and had input to an easy code that they presented to the BBRS, again, back in May 2020. It's got the pieces. We know what we need to do in terms of getting our buildings, especially as you had mentioned before, new construction. So we've got some of that already, and I just sort of want to urge that we don't need to find our solutions. We know what the solutions are. We just need to get them going. And I'm concerned that in terms of coming up with a new building code and a new stretch building code for municipalities to adopt, that it's going to be another 1.5 to 2 years before that gets into place. And we don't have, especially for new buildings, we don't have the time. Don't have the time to lose. And why would we let new buildings being built now use taxpayer money in the future to retrofit them in order to meet our goals. We've got to accelerate at that, especially for new buildings. I'll end it there. I'm sorry, I didn't actually have a question. I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your comment.
Great. So we have a few more questions in the list here, and I'll ask them. And anyone else who's joining us who would like to ask questions or provide feedback, input live, feel free to raise your hand and I'll call on you. We have a question here regarding, sorry, I was answering one question. How does agriculture fit into our thinking and planning on solar?
Our current solar program, the SMART program, does have specific incentives for dual use for farmland that has solar deployments. At the same time, we are working with our sister agencies on the agricultural side to make sure that that policy itself is well balanced so that we don't create adverse outcome by encouraging dual use. But thank you for that question.
Okay, great. We're gonna go to Paul Shorb now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Now I can.
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. So this question may be a little bit repetitive of the last comment and earlier comment, but maybe I missed part of an answer. The way I put it in question form is, why not mandate ASAP a ban on new gas hookups for new construction and major retrofits, major modifications?
That is a great question. Well, why not ban it now is that we don't have the legal right to ban it now. We are developing new building codes to ensure that new buildings can be built as efficiently as possible and will be built as efficiently as possible. And by the way, buildings are not uniform, right? So we have very different types of buildings around the Commonwealth. So we have to really consider what exactly were we talking about when we say building. There is no one type of building. There are many types of buildings. So we must take into account the types of buildings and the use of the buildings when we set building codes. But we are, in general, as I said, the most important thing is to tighten the envelope so that we can consume as little as possible to heat our buildings and to cool our buildings. And so that is the number one goal for the new building codes. And then in addition to that, we are aiming to have zero emission or close to zero emissions electric grid, so that transitioning to electricity is the target. So the idea is to tighten the envelope so that the consumption of any heating and cooling resources would be as small as possible, and transition that heating and cooling to electric grid, and transition the electric grid to zero emitting or close to zero emitting in the future. That is essentially the strategy.
Right, I get those other points, but so I guess the answer I'm hearing is you don't have the legal authority to ban new gas hookups except through a building code. If I'm hearing that answer correctly.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking through the list of questions here. And so a question came in: how do we consider incentivizing lawn contractors to transition to electric mowers and blowers?
Sorry, could you say that again, Han? How do we what?
Yeah, how do we incent how would we consider incenting lawn contractors to transition to electric mowers and electric blowers from gas? This is in response to Governor Gavin Newsom from California, who signed a law that requires small off-road engines, including those in lawnmowers and leaf blowers, to be plug-in or battery operated by 2024. So I guess this person is asking, are we approaching the same, having the same approach?
I have an electric mower and it's great. It's quieter, and it's affordable, and it's clean. So we currently don't have a program specific for lawnmowers, but that's probably something we could consider in the future. I don't have a great answer for that question at this moment.
Okay. And then let's see, I'm trying to see which questions haven't been asked. Sorry, haven't been answered. One person asked about scope 2 and scope 3 emissions of heating fuels. So I'll explain this question a little more. Scope 1 emissions is on-site fossil fuel usage. Scope 2 is outside of the jurisdiction, I believe. And scope 3 is the life cycle emissions associated with the fossil fuel. So this person is asking, will we consider scope 2 and scope 3 emissions for heating fuels? Or we solely focus on scope 1, which is on-site combustion?
That is a good question. I can say that we are not setting emissions reduction limits accounting for life cycle greenhouse gas emissions yet. If that changes in the future, it may be useful to conduct the analysis, but our goal right now is not yet to account for the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with everything we use and everything we buy. Well, I'm not sure about scope 1 and scope 2 because we are doing economy-wide emissions reduction. We are setting economy-wide emissions reductions. So in that sense, it's not just on-site limits, right? It's not just the limit on the on-site use, it's economy-wide use. So in that sense, we are accounting for all of the emissions associated with the use and the production of production that sits inside Massachusetts.
Okay, that question was from Sarah Griffith. If you wanted to clarify your question, or if I explained scope 2 and scope 3 incorrectly, feel free to chime in. I'll allow you to speak if so, should you want to speak.
Sure, thank you. I guess I wanted to know about the scope questions specifically related to heating fuels because they are imported from outside the state. And especially in the case of hydrogen, there are huge emissions. It's much more polluting than just using the methane directly when you look at scope 2 and scope 3. And those emissions, even if they are in another state, are going to affect us. They're going to be, the cause of flooding in Massachusetts. So that's why I emphasize that.
I see. No, that is a really good question, Sarah. When we set the target and measure the accomplishments against those limits, we are not yet considering the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. That is a really good question, though. We probably should think about in the future how we would want to account for life cycle emissions.
Sure. Thank you.
And you also bring up indirectly, you also bring up the idea that the topic of leakage, right? So
Yes.
that
Yeah.
is also something we should, if not start thinking about, really think about, because leakage will become important if we, we're not an island alone. We're a small state with a large economy, but we are still only one individual state. So we do need to
Right.
also think about leakages. Good question.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So we have a couple minutes left. So I'll probably hit on one more question, and for anyone who submitted questions that Judy haven't got a chance to answer, please feel free to email us at gwsa@mass.gov and we can provide an answer response then. So this last question is, how much will building heat electrification cost? Have we considered, how are we considering cost in electrification of building heat?
The transition for heating in buildings in the near future is actually accounted for in the Mass Save, energy efficiency, and energy transition programs. So in that sense, we are approaching it from a cost-effective perspective and try to account for the benefits against the cost and adopt programs that are cost effective in that sense. Thank you for that question.
All right. So Judy, would you like to close out this meeting here?
Yes. Thank you very much for everybody who have stayed on till 8 p.m. at night, and very much appreciate your participation, and also give us a chance to share with you what we've been working on. As Han mentioned, if you have any additional question, please reach out. We have another session tomorrow at 12 noon. In case you have additional question and want to hear it again, want to hear our presentation again. So thank you very much for your participation. I look forward to continuing our dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Ending meeting.